the last dozen years, that has been the welcome sound for Canadian pilot Louis Helbig when he fires up his antique 1948 single-engine Luscombe aircraft. When he bought the tiny two-seater back in 2013, he intended to use it for his work as an aerial photographer. But he also loved that his plane has a remarkable pedigree. For those in the know in the aviation world, it's famous, the Trans-Atlantic Luscombe, once owned by a German Jewish Holocaust survivor named Peter Gluckmann, who in 1953 flew it solo at age 27 from San Francisco through Canada, then across the North Atlantic to Germany. Now, he was a watchmaker, not a lifelong pilot, and he'd mostly wanted to fly in order to reunite with his parents and his younger brother, who had also survived but stayed in Europe. He also had it in his mind to see what had become of his boyhood home in Berlin. All that seemed quite impossible because then it was the Cold War and Berlin was under U.S. and Russian control and off limits to private tourists in civilian planes, but Gluckmann did it anyway. And his flying achievement was also amazing because at the time, his plane was much smaller than the ones flown by those iconic heroes who crossed the Atlantic Ocean before him, Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart. Louis Helbig, the current owner, lives in Sydney, Nova Scotia, and he'd hoped to keep the Luscombe airborne for a few years more. But this summer, he made a rough landing on a trip to Guelph and damaged it. It's still there, sitting under a tarp, needing expensive repairs. Winter's coming, and he says his insurance company is offering to write it off and likely scrap it after the end of October. Helbig feels his plane and Gluckmann's story both deserve a better ending. He'd love for a museum to take it. He's tried the Smithsonian in Washington and some museums in Europe too, but so far, no dice. He wants it to be put on display as a tribute to Gluckmann, who disappeared forever a few years after his flight near Hawaii, flying a different plane. Helbig's motivated also because Gluckmann's life was linked to Helbig's own family background. Helbig is of German origin too, and recently discovered to his horror that his grandfather was a brown shirt in Hitler's Nazi regime.
It gives me even more sort of an incentive, I guess, to take this airplane as an artifact and to have it as a thing that can then foster reflection on the time that he was a witness to.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Friday, October 24th, 2025. Welcome to North Star, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, and made possible thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Gronowski-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Louis Helbig feels he's running out of time to save his Luscombe, so he set up a website with the story of his plane, its various flights, tons of photos, and the short but dramatic life of Peter Gluckmann. Now, Gluckmann did get some worldwide recognition. He was in Time magazine, he made headlines in newspapers from London to Australia, and one article even quotes his relieved mother in London hugging and kissing her son after he landed, but scolding him for being so overweight. Gluckmann tipped the scales at over 250 pounds, and he did some serious dieting when he got back to America to make his subsequent trips. Louis Helbig joins me now from his home in Sydney, Nova Scotia. It's a great honor to have you. You reached out to us through our CJN sources with an incredible story about a plane, the Holocaust, World War II, transatlantic flight, your own piloting and aviation journey, and your own family story. And I keep telling you, there's a book and a movie. But before that all happens, we're going to get this story out to our audience and our listeners. And so let's talk about the plane. Describe this plane and how you got it.
Why do I have this Luscombe? Well, I used to own another version of a Luscombe called an 8A, which is the smaller engine and the like, and I needed something with a sort of longer range for the photography that I was doing. And so I found this thing called an 8F. And basically, it can fly further. It has electrics and a few other sort of modern gizmos, as modern as something is from 1948.
How many seats? How many wings? Like, describe, because this is on a podcast too. So
So the plane is very basic. It's got 2 seats, a pilot seat and a passenger seat. It's a side-by-side seating, and it's got a high wing as opposed to a low wing. It has a very small motor on the front, 90 horsepower motor on it. And I can fly it. I usually flight plan for about 4 hours in the air. I can fly it for a bit longer than that, actually, in reality. But sort of 4 hours is good and safe.
Who'd you buy it from?
I bought it from a fellow named Richard Marcus, and he was in London, Ontario. And he, in turn, found the plane in the late 80s in pieces in a barn or in a hangar in Akron, Ohio. I had never heard of this thing before that, and I was intrigued, and I did a bit of research. And it has a wee bit of a rock star following in the world of people who know Luscombes, and quite justifiably so, for having been flown across the Atlantic by Peter Gluckmann in 1953.
Now, you said you could do 4 hours, and a transatlantic flight today, if you go from Newfoundland to Iceland, is that about the same?
No. So he modified the aircraft slightly, not an awful lot, and so he had approximately 15 hours of flight time. So he could sit there for 15 hours and safely stay in the air.
He couldn't go high like we can today, and it was icing and cold, and he could only fly low, right?
Yeah. So modern aviation and the big jets, the Airbuses and Boeings, they fly above the weather. But in the days of propeller aviation, you're right in the turbulent part of the atmosphere. So you fly into clouds, you fly into ice, you fly into goodness knows what. And so, yeah, these were the kinds of hazards of navigation that existed during his time. For the most part, he flew kind of like ancient navigators used to navigate the seas. And he was very good at it. He managed to, using dead reckoning, it's called, he managed to get himself across from Goose Bay, across to a place called Bluey 1, which wasn't actually an American base anymore, but the airport in the south of Greenland. And then he flew around to Reykjavik. There's 2 airports there. He flew on to Glasgow, but then the weather was socked in completely, and he ended up landing at another place some distance away from there. St. Andrews, I think, but I'm not actually sure.
So you have this guy's plane. You don't really know much about him. What have you then learned about who he was and how he came to do this?
So a bit like the other aviation gigs, I was intrigued by the transatlantic story, right? There's a lot of risk associated with that. The fellow was brave. I mean, albeit in 1953, the plane was only 5 years old, and and now it's much older and what have you. But still, it's amazing what he did as an aviation accomplishment. As I dug some more, I learned that he was a refugee. He was a Jewish refugee from Berlin, and his family fled Berlin in 1939, and they fled to London, which I know was very late for many people to get out of Germany. And his family stayed in London, and then he emigrated in 1947.
It was like 12 when he escaped Hitler.
Exactly. He was almost 13 years old.
So he would have had his bar mitzvah. Yeah.
Just at that age. And so off he goes to the States.
So hang on. He goes to the States after the war, 1947. So they ride out the war. They were interned, some of them, because they were enemy aliens. The British didn't treat German Jews well, even if they were the actual victims. They thought they were the fifth columnists. And his father was an electrical engineer, I think.
Yeah.
And his mom, I don't know what she did. And then there was a brother as well, William.
There's a brother as well, too. So I have one photo from the press clippings I found. There's a brother, William, and they're standing in front of a different plane a few years later, and there's brother William along with some mother and the father.
They were all grown up by then. So he basically waited. He went to San Francisco to seek his fortune.
That's right.
He didn't stay in London.
So he emigrates in 47. He ends up in San Francisco within weeks or days, I don't know. He opens a shop. It's on Lick Avenue, I think it's called, in San Fran. And then he gets an exception to learn how to fly an airplane, because as an alien, you weren't allowed to get a pilot's license, apparently, in the States at that time. Sometime after that, he buys this airplane. And then he gets this idea that he can fly over the Atlantic to visit his parents who are in London.
Who he hasn't seen in years, right?
Well, what's that, 6 years he would have not seen them. So almost now bizarrely compared to what it costs to fly in a commercial plane nowadays, he figured it was going to cost him less to fly his airplane to London this way than if he was to fly or take the boat or whatever to get back to London. So I think he estimated it was going to cost him $300, and I think all told it cost him about $400 for fuel and
It's crazy.
lodging and meals or whatever.
How did he get permission to do this? It was the Cold War. Who gets to fly a private plane into all these places? That's the most interesting thing is he lucked, I don't know, luck or perseverance. He got to London. Then he continued on into the Cold War part of Europe.
Yeah. So there's one eyewitness account I've got. There's one person who was there in Goose Bay at the American base. At the time, it was an American base. And they told him he couldn't fly across. And he said, oh, well, then I won't. Then he gets in the plane, he takes off, and he goes off in the direction he wants to go to, opposite to what he said he was going to do. So I think he just went ahead and did it.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, it's sort of more normalized, I suppose. At one point, he mistakenly lands at some top secret base, which might have been Boscombe Downs. He gets lost. And in an article, he says, my goodness, it's embarrassing to lose his way in the last few hundred miles of flying down to London. But so that's one layer of this. But of course, 1953, we are in the midst of the Cold War. In 48 and 49, the Russians blockaded Berlin, and there was the famous airlift. So that's sort of hanging in the background. And just as he's flying across, there is the East German uprising against the Russians that happens in June 17th, 1953. That would have been the news when he got to London. Anyway, he gets to London. There's this beautiful picture of him hugging his mother. His mother is not impressed.
But he didn't hang around for that long. He stayed for a while and visited his mom and saw where he grew up. And then he wanted to fill a bucket list to go back and give a middle finger to Hitler and go back to Germany. And he gets there.
That's right. I don't know how many people still remember this, I suppose. So much has happened. But Berlin was an occupied city until 1989, technically until 1990, right? It was occupied by the Russians, the Americans, the French, and the British. West Berlin was where the French and the British and the Americans were. So here he goes. He goes to the ambassador, the American ambassador in the UK, and he gets permission. He gets a letter of permission that he can fly to Berlin-Tempelhof. And Berlin-Tempelhof was the center of the Nazi aviation. Yeah, it was their showpiece. And off he goes. He flies to Hanover. He lands at the American base there. The base commander looks at him and says, "You're not going there. No, wait. No, there's no way you can do that. No one's done that, and you will not get permission." And lo and behold, he pulls his letter out and he says, well, I guess you can go. And off he goes. He flies into Berlin-Tempelhof, which is just amazing. So he certainly is the very first private civilian aircraft to land in Berlin. It's also very likely the only private civilian aircraft that landed there.
Why do you think he wanted to go to Berlin so badly?
I think there's a bunch of things. One is this pull to go home. Like, he grew up there. He had his house there. He had his friends there. He played on the streets.
Right, but there was the Holocaust, and all the friends were probably gone and deported or and bombed by the Allies.
Yeah, I mean, so he has that. He goes back. I think of a bit of the Sunken Villages project I did, where people have had their homes removed from them. They have no place to go back to. They can't Google their address and go back to the place because it's gone. It's not underwater. Well, in some ways, there's same thing for Peter. He goes to where his house was. His house is gone. It's not even that there is some rubble, and Berlin in 1953 was still absolutely in rubble. People were still growing potatoes and carrots and what have you in between the rubble kind of thing to get by. And he goes to where his house was, and it's just gone. It's just gone, period. It's just think of that. Think of all the people who were there, who he would have known, his friends, his cousins. They're gone too. But in the other part that really comes across is he was very fascinated by what was going on with the Cold War. And then he flies home.
Ever since October 7th, 2023, Muslim and Jewish communities in Canada have been torn apart.
I've known you for 20 years. You've been at my house for Shabbat supper, I don't know how many times. And for 1 second, you can't put down your friend and just hold my hand?
We're fed a constant stream of Jews and Muslims talking at each other, about each other, but rarely do we hear them talking to each other.
Why are you doing this? What's the benefit of doing this?
This podcast aims to do something different. I'm Avi Feingold, a rabbi and a writer with the Canadian Jewish News.
I'm Yafa Sakeja, a Canadian-Palestinian entrepreneur and volunteer with the Canadian Friends of Standing Together.
We're sitting down with Jews and Muslims, Israelis and Palestinians from coast to coast and across the political divide, having difficult conversations in good faith.
We are not the Israeli government. Palestinians are not Hamas.
This is the place where we're both supposed to end up, Israeli and Palestinian, Arab and Jewish.
Subscribe to In Good Faith, wherever you listen to podcasts.
And he got a hero's welcome. His synagogue, the local mayor, the Time magazine, like he was a big celebrity around the world, and not only aviation.
Yeah, so then, as best as I can piece together, he then wants to go back and fly out again. So, and I finally found a record a couple of days ago where by inference, I now know that he tried flying the same plane across the Atlantic again. And he flew out to Gander in Newfoundland. And the Canadians told him, "You're not flying." Maybe there already were rules, or maybe there were new rules. And so he hopped on a commercial plane. At that time, that wasn't a big deal because all the planes landed in Gander to fly on. That was just the way it was. And so, so he left his Luscombe in Gander, and he went to see his parents in London and did whatever he did. Then he buys himself a different airplane called the Cessna 190. And then another little tidbit, he flies the very first airplane to fly from Israel to Egypt. It's the very first actual flight between the two countries.
All right, Louis. So we gotta understand, what do you feel about him now that you know him? You're in his plane. What connects you to him when you think about this?
Well, for one, it's just simply being in the same space. I went to Goose Bay with the airplane, so I've flown there, landed there. When I landed there, I couldn't resist. And I said, "Oh, this is the plane. This is, it was happened in 1953 and what have you." And, "Oh, wow, that's really cool." And there was chit-chat on the air traffic control. So there's that. There's this idea of being in the same space. It just seems incredible, sort of a pinch me kind of thing, that you could be in the same little tin box of an airplane. And that's what he looked through. And the panel he put into that airplane is more or less still there. The paint on the inside is what the paint was when he had it. There's a lot that's very similar. I think about what he might think about what I'm doing and with it, and I put myself in his boots in terms of what he did. But the other part that really intrigues me is we have, in some senses, a similar background and a very different background at the same time. So I'm of German ethnicity. I speak German, and there's a German phrase, a word called Zeitzeuge, so to be the witness to your time. And he is a witness to incredible things. He is a victim. He is a witness to. He survives. His family survives, or at least part of his family survives. His immediate family, and he goes back to what he was pushed away from. He's also entirely drawn into the whole Cold War thing as well, too, in terms of what he sees and what he experiences. There's something there sort of essential. There's something profoundly human about what he's doing. And he's pushing boundaries in himself. He's got certain dreams, if you will, about what he wants to do. And he acts on those, and he does that with this little airplane, and then later on with his other airplanes as well, too. And it's not just a sense of adventure or whatever. I think that's too trite. There's something more going on there in terms of what he's doing, what he lives through, what he does, how he perseveres. And then he feeds off a bit of fame that he gets as well, too, as it goes along. So that sort of helps. And he's able to make something of a living, I think, from some of the things that he's doing as he gets to be sort of more well-known and famous. But the essence of it is kind of like there's something magical about being in the air.
You mentioned you had family in the area where he landed. So I need to ask you how, as the descendants of Germans who are not Jewish, that your family perhaps were part of the Nazi or German government regime, brown shirts. How do you navigate, and I don't mean the pun, but how do you do both being the grandson of someone who were the perpetrators of this story that you're telling of a German Jewish Holocaust survivor who escaped to, as you just said, do great things?
That's a tough question. I think that one of the reasons why I am so keen on Gluckmann's story being told and the aircraft being used as an artifact at a museum is that it opens the door to exactly these kinds of difficult, contradictory questions, and where we can reflect on things. So on my paternal side, there was no cooperation with the Nazis. There was no relationship there at all. They were urban bourgeois people who were very skeptical, as I think a lot of people in Berlin were very skeptical and resistant to the Nazis. But on my maternal side, much to my horror, I discovered this evidence that shows very clearly that my grandfather was a brown shirt. He marched around and, full-on Heil Hitler. And he ran a bookstore / stationery store. And there's a picture on Hitler's 50th birthday of, all this stuff in it, with him and my grandmother standing in front, proud as punch. And it makes me... So when I learned this a couple of years ago, I wasn't thinking of Peter Gluckmann or anything. I was just shocked and appalled that was part of my past. And I couldn't believe it. I was just categorically shocked that I didn't know that existed. I had no sense of that within my own family and my own family connections of any celebration of that sort of thing. I've always heard about the war as being this horrific thing where, family members died, there was deprivation, all these horrible things. And I've never heard anything else within my own family. It was shocking.
And so what does telling Peter Gluckmann's story do for you? How does that bring you to a new place? You mentioned processing.
Oh, that's a great question. I'll go back one step further and that's just talk about my work as an artist. So what I've done in the past is I create these images, often very abstract aerial photos, some of them which were taken from this airplane. And I put them in front of people in exhibitions or in my book or what have you. And then people engage with these things and they say, oh, it's a piece of art or whatever. And opens a door then to reflect on what it is that they're seeing and whatever they feel about it, implications they might have personally or broadly, the environment, climate change, whatever it might be, doesn't matter. Like they own it and they can think about it. And I guess the power in it is it's sort of an on object, if you will. It's an airplane, little airplane, which, some people will think, oh, it's cool, it's retro, it's whatever. And then the aviation types, they'll go, oh, that's cool, it flew across the Atlantic and what have you. But I think the real thing is you can use those hooks to then go into a story, this very real person and his life story. And then you can extrapolate from there and you can hopefully begin to relate to what he experienced. What did his parents experience?
Back to practical matters, you owned the plane, you had an accident with it, and you can't fix it or you can fix it. Tell us about when this happened.
Well, yeah, so I had a landing incident back in June with this thing. So I had some bad luck and I ground looped the plane. So the plane ended up going sideways. In the process, it then stressed the landing gear and stressed the skins. And so that the airplane now has a whole bunch of bends in it, in the skins of the aircraft, which require repair. And as it stands right now, it looks like the aircraft would be a write-off.
How much is this plane worth? $20,000 to $30,000 now on the open market, give or take, if you were to sell it? Once they fix it up?
Oh, when it's all fixed up, at $40,000, $50,000. But the agreed value that's on the airplane, they want to write it off. And then if it gets written off, there's a very real risk that it just simply gets crushed or destroyed. And I want to prevent that. I want this thing to live on. And ideally, I would like it to live on as a museum artifact. I don't want the plane to be lost. If it was just any other Luscombe, so what? There's still hundreds, thousands of these things still around. They were built, mass built at one point. But yeah, I want it to go to a good home so that it is preserved for what it symbolizes. And it would break my heart if it just ends up being crushed or the significance of it gets lost, kind of thing.
Thank you for being with us and thank you for telling the story. And I'm sure we will hear more in the future and come back with good news.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of North Star, made possible thanks to the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Now, you can see photos of the Luscombe and learn more at Louis Helbig's website. The links are in our show notes. If Helbig's plan doesn't work to save this piece of Jewish history from the scrap heap, he hopes at least someone would buy the Luscombe and restore it. North Star is produced by Andrea Varsany and Zachary Judah Kaufman. Michael Freeman is the executive producer, and the theme is by Brett Higgins. Thanks so much for listening.